Да? Да? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll start the press conference of Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Sergey Lavrov. It will be in Russian. Interpretation into English is provided. And let us start from the question from UN Correspondent Association President, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister, for this press conference on behalf of UNGA. It's Valeria Robecco from ANSA News West Service, and my question is on Afghanistan. So, which opportunities and risk factors does the new Taliban Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan present? And also, Russia fears that the presence of Taliban could somehow feed the components of Islamic extremism in the region, or do you think the Taliban can slow down, for example, the ISIS-K? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Afghanistan is, of course, currently in everyone's minds. We believe, and we continue to believe, we believe this from the very beginning, that the developments are a reality. What happened is a reality. Unfortunately, the hasty withdrawal, let's call it that, of U.S. troops and other NATO troops was carried out without any consideration of the consequences. And as you know, the consequences are that there are many weapons left in Afghanistan. And we all see the need to see to it that these weapons not be taken up and used for destructive purposes. And the reality that is currently unfolding there is based on statements from the Taliban, who have proclaimed their intent to combat extremism, to combat terrorism, including the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, not to project instability on neighbors. They have announced that they will comply with and they will respect women's rights. They've announced that they will see to it that there be the creation of an inclusive government. You know about all of this. And now what's most important probably is for these promises to be honored. The first step was taken, the creation of transitional structures, a government structure. Of course, this does not reflect the whole gamut of Afghan society, ethno-religious and political forces. So we are engaged in contacts. They're ongoing. This is not the first year that these contacts have been going on, and we are continuing them through the expanded troika of Russia, U.S., China, Pakistan, and most recently, our representatives. I refer to the Russian, Chinese, and Pakistani representatives. They traveled to Doha, then they traveled to Kabul, where they engaged both with the Taliban and with the representatives of secular authorities. I'm talking about former President Karzai and the former head of the National Consensus Council, Abdullah Abdul. The discussion, first of all, focused on the need to ensure that there be the creation of such a government structure that would be genuinely representative. The Taliban have announced that they were seeking to ensure that this be a reality. The current structure is temporary. So what's most important, once again, is to ensure that the promises that they've proclaimed publicly, for those promises to be kept. And for us, that is the top priority. That is what was mentioned, the inadmissibility of the spread of extremism and spilling over into neighboring countries. And of course, it is absolutely unacceptable for the terrorist threat to persist on Afghan soil. So they announced that they're determined to fight ISIL and other terrorist groups, and we will do everything possible to support them to ensure that this be made a reality. This is Interfox. A question on Afghanistan. Is Russia considering the possibility of easing or lifting a national sanctions regime vis-a-vis those Taliban who are presently in the new government, to ease contacts with them? And what is the position that Russia is planning to adopt in discussions at the United Nations of the easing or lifting of international sanctions against the Taliban? Yeah. The current situation is not limiting or obstructing our contacts with the Taliban, as I've already mentioned. Furthermore, sanctions of the Security Council, as they currently stand in the relevant resolutions, do not prohibit such contacts. Quite the contrary, Security Council resolutions have a need enshrined, the need to advance the political process, and this is impossible to achieve without working with the Taliban. And our contacts, as I mentioned, they are long-standing contacts with this movement. Our contacts are first and foremost geared towards ensuring that the security and safety of Russian citizens be upheld, and second, to facilitate intra-Afghan reconciliation and the intra-Afghan political process. I have not heard anybody raise the question at the Security Council about the need for a forthcoming meeting to touch upon the question of easing or lifting international sanctions. Once again, I would note that for the purposes of the current work with the Taliban movement, that is not necessary. And I think that everybody, as I mentioned in response to the previous question, will all anticipate that the Taliban will comply with all of their commitments and that they honor the promises they made. And then we will take a look at how the terrorist and narcotics threat from Afghanistan, whether they have been eliminated.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. James Bays from Al Jazeera. Two quick follow-ups on Afghanistan. The Secretary-General has warned of the catastrophic consequences there would be if there was an economic collapse in Afghanistan. What do you think about the idea of unfreezing Afghanistan's funds that are held by international institutions? And secondly, you seem, from what you've just said, to have a policy of judging the Taliban on its actions. Tell me, how is the ideology of the Taliban different from other Islamist groups in other parts of the world, for example in Syria, groups that you oppose and have been bombing?
In Syria, as you know, there's a terrorist safe haven. The nexus is there. Almost all of Syrian territory has been liberated. However, in Idlib province, the so-called de-escalation zone, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is calling the shots there. This is an offshoot of Jabhat al-Nusra. This has been set out in all Security Council resolutions, and the terrorist organizations pose a great threat there. So I don't see any problem here in terms of eliminating terrorists in Syria. We are talking with our Turkish partners. 2 years ago, they signed a special agreement with us to the effect that they will combat terrorists in the Idlib de-escalation zone, and that they will differentiate them from those armed groups that are not terrorist groups, those who are cooperating with the Turkish military personnel. And in a few days, there will be another meeting between the presidents of the Russian Federation and Turkey, and during that there will be a discussion of how these commitments are complied with. This is, of course, something that is slow, which is clear. Turning to the Taliban as compared with other groups, once again, probably we cannot separate terrorists into good and bad terrorists. However, those sanctions that have been imposed against the Taliban have a number of loopholes. First and foremost, exemptions, that is, so that there be dialogue possible. That means the Security Council recognizes the Taliban as an integral part of Afghan society. As for Jabhat al-Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, that is not the case for them, and that is, I think, where the difference lies. So, of course, we will encourage those who have taken power now in Kabul after the flight of foreign contingents for them to behave in a civilized manner.
Funds, Afghanistan's international funds.
We already talked about that. We believe that this is a question that needs to be considered at the practical level, specifically on the basis of those positions that you mentioned, quoting the Secretary General. The government of the Taliban has determined candidates for the ambassador post in Russia. Will Russia accredit the individuals heading up the movement? We don't have any information about anybody having turned to us for the accreditation. There is an ambassador working in Moscow who was appointed by the previous government, and the question of international recognition of the Taliban at the present juncture is not on the table. We will proceed from that premise if we receive a request for the appointment of a new ambassador.
Николай Иванов, МИЦ «Известия».
Sergey Viktorovich, we've heard Biden's statement, and he said that the era of wars is over, that the era of diplomacy has been ushered in. Do you believe that? Second, what about diplomatic property? Has there been progress? And with the visa and the delegation, there was a danger for our delegations not to be allowed into the General Assembly due to vaccination requirements. As we know, the vaccine that was approved here in the U.S. Thank you. I don't think that this is an attempt to do ill, but it is something of it seems that this is a loss. As for in-person authorities, there's an important. I cannot blame New York authorities for being very safe. This is a problem throughout the world. There are many variants of this virus, so precautionary measures are of course important here, and they are warranted. And as you quite rightly say, we do not accept attempts to discriminate against vaccines that are not registered in the United States. Which have repeatedly proven to be effective. This is applicable to Sputnik V. EU countries, Hungary, Slovakia, for example, have already registered our vaccine. And this is an example for other members of the European Union and North Atlantic Alliance. Turning to visas for delegations, yes, visas were issued not just taking into account the epidemiological considerations, but also with the well-known political delays. This is something which was obvious. We saw this. A number of our staff have not yet been granted visas, including State Duma deputies who are a part of the delegation. And of course, we will see to it that the leadership of the UN Secretariat ensure that their obligations be complied with, to ensure that all agreements be complied with that have been set out in the agreement between the United Nations and the host state, that is the United States of America. There are many problems that have amassed, egregious violations of this agreement, egregious violations of the obligation of the host state of the UN headquarters, including the above-mentioned removal of diplomatic property. The General Assembly Committee on Host State Relations has already expressed its view that this is not acceptable, it is not right, and the Secretary General has noted the need for arbitration to begin vis-a-vis these activities by the U.S. Yesterday I met with him. I reminded him of this. I'm very pleased that his legal advisor was present, Mr. Schwarz, during the discussion, who is duty-bound to initiate the necessary measures, and these measures are very late. And your first question, yes. President Biden said that the United States will never again use force to change the arrangements or structures in other countries. Never say never. We know how the Trump administration took it upon itself to withdraw from the Iran nuclear agreement, which was agreed to by the Obama administration. And now, incidentally, negotiations are underway to fully restore the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians, among other things, are putting a question to the Iranians. Can we sign in the revitalization of actions under the plan, can we set out that the next administration will respect what we are agreeing upon? The U.S. has said, no, we cannot do this because that's our system. There's international law and other systems. And the second thing that Biden said, that the era of aggressive diplomacy is being ushered in, this probably means that they will use other means to attempt to determine the lives in other countries. The same colored revolutions is not force, but is equally destructive as force being used. Look at Libya, consider Iraq, consider Syria, and consider our neighbor, Ukraine. So we just wanted the U.S. to take the next step and to comply with its obligation, not to use force, to gain in one-up on others, not to do that, to acknowledge that we are all different, we have cultural, civilizational roots which differ, but we live on one planet, we need to respect one another.
Пожалуйста, газета «Коммерсант».
Commerçant newspaper. According to our information, active preparations are underway for Deputy Secretary of State to visit Moscow. At what stage are these negotiations, and when can we expect this visit to take place? And most importantly, what does Moscow expect in response for the lifting of sanctions on somebody on the Russian blacklist? Well, if you have such sources of information, then why don't you ask those who gave that information to you? We are preparing a number of contacts through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with the State Department. This isn't the only area where on which we are currently carrying out discussions, and we believe that when both sides come to an agreement about the contact taking place at a specific time on a specific issue, we will make the corresponding announcement.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Foreign Minister. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. A follow-up on the JC.
I know, you never leave.
That's true. It's true. I live here. Nice to see you again. My question is a follow-up on the JCPOA. The U.S. Secretary of State Blinken said it has to be soon. Time is running out. The Iran foreign minister yesterday said they're ready. It seems that they're getting mixed messages from the United States, but it should be soon. You negotiated this deal. Can you play out, or you were part of the negotiations, can you play out what happens if the U.S. doesn't get back on? Iran keeps advancing its nuclear program. What's the worst case scenario that you see? Thank you.
Знаете,
Iran isn't doing anything that would be prohibited. Iran is complying with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the additional protocol to the agreements and guarantees. It is not complying with most of the obligations under the GCPOA currently, which is simply not currently enforced because the U.S. Exited that agreement, and the conversation now is about fully restoring that agreement, following which Iran would have no justification to make any exceptions to the obligations that it has taken upon itself. And the IAEA and its Director General personally is in contact with Iran, and they have a full picture of what is happening there. They are not being blocked access to the work that Iran is carrying out under its nuclear program, and the IAEA does not have any justification to believe that the conclusion that was made in 2015 about the absence of any signs of redirecting the nuclear program towards military needs, well, that conclusion no longer applies. They have no basis to review this, and they've said this outright. Of course, we would like the negotiations for the full-fledged restoration of the JCPOA to resume as soon as possible. But first of all, the government in Iraq has just formed, and they are saying that they need at least a couple of weeks, and hopefully not more, to put together the negotiating team because they've had some staff changes in the government. Secondly, when the U.S. exited the JCPOA, Iran for more than a year continued to comply in good faith with everything that it had undertaken in accordance with that document, in the hope that the U.S. would come to its senses and come back to that deal. So saying now that the time is running out, anybody could say this, but not Washington. It was, of course, the previous administration, but this is what the current administration has inherited, and the current administration was, in fact, the author behind the JCPOA. So it seems evident that they should be more active in resolving all issues related to this. There is one topic, and that is the sanctions that the U.S. unlawfully introduced against Iran, allegedly for violating the JCPOA. But those sanctions relate not only to the Iranian party, they also introduce sanctions against all those who lawfully trade with Iran, including shipments of military goods, the prohibition of which has elapsed. And those sanctions should also be lifted as part of restoring the JCPOA, and all of Iran's trade partners in all areas should not suffer from unilateral U.S. measures.
Go down if that happens? And by the way, there's a footnote. The translator said Iraq, you said Iran, so just putting it on the record. Does Iran's economy just collapse if this doesn't happen?
Из-за чего?
If what doesn't happen if the JCPOA isn't restored?
Ну, мы такие сценарии даже не рассматриваем.
Well, we're not even considering such scenarios. We have a fairly serious hope, and I think this is well-founded optimism that we will be able to achieve results. At the very least, this is something everybody wants, including the US and Iran.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. Betül Yürük, Turkish news agency Anadolu. The calm in the northwest of Syria has changed with Russia intensifying its airstrikes in recent weeks, particularly ahead of a summit between President Erdogan and President Putin. Why is Russia stepping up its attacks just before this summit? And another question on Syria as well. Is there an agreement or a consensus between Russia and the US following a meeting in Geneva between the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister and US National Security Council Coordinator Brett McGurk, which took place in Geneva? Thank you. On the east of Euphrates, an agreement between Russia and the
On the
US.
east of Ukraine,
Right, yes, thank you.
between my deputy and McGurk.
There was a meeting in Geneva between the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister and Brett McGurk on the east of Euphrates
When?
recently.
No, I'm not aware of this. We don't have a special channel with the United States to discuss Ukraine.
Euphrates in
my God.
Syria, not Ukraine.
Вы знаете, мы на первый вопрос.
Regarding the first question, that was really quite something about Ukraine, wasn't it? Regarding the situation in the northwest of Syria, we are using force there in accordance with the requirements of Resolution 2254 of the Security Council of the UN, which stipulates that there needs to be an uncompromising fight against terrorism on Syrian soil. And I already mentioned earlier that there was a special agreement on Idlib between the presidents of Russia and Turkey, and our Turkish colleagues took upon themselves the obligation to separate normal opposition forces from terrorists. And this was to have been done a long time ago now, but it has not happened to date. There is some slow progress, but the terrorist threat that those bandits are projecting from the Idlib de-escalation zone, those threats are recurrent. And from the de-escalation zone, these people are attacking both the positions of the Syrian army, and they also repeatedly have attempted to launch attack UAVs against our military base in Khomeini. So our Turkish colleagues are well aware that we will not accept such behavior, and we will not accept such attitudes on the part of these bandits, of these thugs, regarding the role carried out by Turkish military servicemen in the Idlib de-escalation zone. We will indeed talk about this specifically in the context of preparing for the meeting of the two presidents, and at the meeting itself, which I think will be taking place on September 29th. This will be one of the main issues on the agenda: how to achieve what we have already agreed on and ensure that terrorists do not have free rein. Regarding contacts with the US on the east of Euphrates, well, those contacts do periodically take place, and in those contacts, we draw attention to the illegitimate nature of the presence of the US on Syrian territory, and we draw attention to the outrageous situation with the area that they occupied, which is the radius of 55 kilometers, called Altanf, and the situation that currently exists in Rukban camp on territory controlled by the U.S. This is a very lengthy, very expansive issue, but the context that we have through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the Security Council, those mostly relate to the fact that, yes, the U.S. is there illegitimately, but they are present there, and that is also a reality. And given their intention to fire weapons with or without good cause, we talk about a deconflicting mechanism, and that mechanism does work. And I would like to draw your attention, by the way, to the fact that this mechanism is working despite the legal prohibitions that the U.S. Congress introduced regarding military contacts. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff recently spoke out publicly in their assessment that this was unwise and that those restrictions on military contacts should be listed, something that I think would be useful not only for deconflicting in Syria, but also further developing our dialogue on arms control in general.
Дай, пожалуйста.
Russia Today television channel.
Yes. Turkey has expressed concerns about the voting of Crimea in the recent State Duma elections. That's despite the fact that Russia has provided humanitarian assistance for COVID-19 to Turkey, as well as military cooperation. Why, I guess my question is, could you address the imbalance, perhaps? What is your analysis of the imbalance in relations? My second question is regarding Mali. France has expressed concern about the presence of military contractors from Russia in Mali. They're now being joined by their European allies in speaking about this concern. I guess my question is, what is Russia's position on this?
Насчет Крыма.
Well, on the topic of Crimea, Turkey was not the only one to claim that they are concerned, that they denounce the voting in Crimea. But I would explain all of this commotion by the following. First of all, 5 years ago, when the previous State Duma elections were held, nobody made such statements. At the very least, they were never so loud. I don't recall something like that happening. And the fact that they're pouncing upon this issue now, including hastily convening the so-called Crimean platform in Kiev, and all this commotion about the elections, I think this is an attempt to detract attention from the fact that Kiev and President Zelensky simply failed when it came to his obligations under the Minsk agreements on overcoming the intra-Ukrainian conflict in the east of the country. This is absolutely evident. Laws are being adapted that essentially prohibit granting the southeast of Ukraine status in connection with the requirements of the Minsk agreements. And we've drawn attention to our Western colleagues to the fact that their proteges are acting against the decisions of the Security Council, because with the Security Council that approved the Minsk agreement, unfortunately, they're all bashfully looking the other way, while Zelensky, meanwhile, has understood that he needs to detract attention from his own failure and his own sabotage of the Minsk agreement, and they are now playing this Crimea card. And the second reason they're doing this is simply perhaps a lack of diplomatic professionalism, a lack of professionalism in foreign policy, because professionals understand full well that the Crimean issue has been put to rest once and for all. And of Mali, you also ask, yes?
I heard these questions. These questions were put to me by the foreign ministers of France and the High Representative of the European Union. You know, there is a transitional government there. Those authorities are undertaking efforts to restore life in constitutional order and to prepare for elections, to restore civilian form of government. And in February, elections were scheduled to be held under the aegis of ECOWAS and the African Union. I would emphasize the transitional government's commitment to international obligations. They've announced this. They are combating terrorism, incidentally, and they have turned to a private military company from Russia in connection with the fact that, as I understand, France wants to significantly draw down its military component, which was present there and, as everybody understood, should have been combating terrorists who established a presence in Kidal. But they didn't manage to do that. The terrorists continue to reign in that area. And insofar as the Malian authorities have assessed their capabilities, their own capabilities, as insufficient, absent external support, and given that external support has been diminished from those who assumed an obligation to help eradicate terrorism there, they have turned to private Russian company. We don't have anything to do with that. This is activity which is being carried out on a legitimate basis, and it applies to relations between the host state, the legitimate government of the host state, which is recognized by all as a legitimate transitional structure on the one hand, and those who are providing services through foreign specialists. I would emphasize that at the government level, not from military company level, but at the government level, we are also contributing to providing for military and defense capacities of Mali, its military readiness to eradicate terrorist threats inter alia. We're providing military and technical equipment as part of our assistance to Mali, but also at the Security Council. Of course, we are contributing to devising the most optimal approaches to pursuit of peacekeeping missions. So once again, I would note that I don't see any reason here to cast any doubt on this. I believe that the foreign minister of Mali, with whom I met yesterday, already told journalists, spoke to journalists about this question. There are no issues here. Better to talk about something else. If our European Union colleagues, as Joseph Borrell told me, decide no longer to work in Africa because Africa is our place, then he said that explicitly. If he wishes to talk about that question, then it would be better to synchronize the operations of both the European Union and the Russian Federation with respect to the fight against terrorism, not just in Mali, but in the Sahel-Sahara region overall. But to say, I was here first, so you go away, that's insulting, first and foremost, for the government in Bamako, which invited external foreign partners, but second, this is not courteous. Russia 24, please. You hear me, yes? Sergey Viktorovich. Just yesterday, on the eve of Russian parliamentary elections, Duma elections, the European Parliament adopted a resolution with a call for the European Commission to prepare not to recognize the results of the Russian vote. Have you discussed this with Joseph Borrell? And does the European Union recognize the Russian vote, the Russian State Duma elections? And if I may, one other important question. Globally, France has called for verification of the agreement between the U.S., Australia, and the United Kingdom on the sale of submarine technology in line with this agreement as to whether this is in line with a nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Do you believe that this is in line with a non-proliferation treaty? And what do you think about this new trilateral alliance, which has made such a commotion and which appears to be at variance with the partnership agreements within NATO, and not just within NATO? On recognition or non-recognition of elections, the European Parliament election recommendations, we have not heard any assessments from the European Union as such, because the European Parliament is not a structure which determines policy of the European Union. I spoke with Borrell about that, of course, and I quoted some of his assessments which were voiced during his statement at the European Parliament, including the completely non-acceptable statement that the European Union differentiates between the regime in Moscow and the Russian people. He very awkwardly and vaguely sought to justify himself, but it was clear that he understood that this was an awkward turn of phrase, to put it mildly. And I hope that this was just a turn of phrase and not the thought, that words take flight and then people may have their regrets. So we don't have any instructions about anybody officially, no indication that anybody has refuted the elections that took place. We don't have any information on that. As for the deal between Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom on submarines, on the whole, of course, this event, which took place immediately after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, inevitably generates questions for those who are members of this alliance. And France, of course, in addition to being insulted and upset at the trade level, but is also thinking in that regard, how reliable are these unions? And now, how much more relevant are discussions becoming about strategic independence of Europe? This is something which, for our Western camp, for their Western camp, of course, these are very important questions that they will have to weigh. We will not interfere in these matters, but the fallout from what is taking place there is, of course, something which we too can be impacted by. This may impact on our relations with the European Union. This may generate interest in the European Union so that there actually be cooperation with us by harnessing the evident geopolitical, geostrategic benefits from existing on one single large continent, especially given that the center of global development is in Asian regions, and so on. We discussed this with many of my interlocutors here who represent the European Union, and I don't think they like what's taking place, especially given that the European Union has been announcing that we would be pushed away, deterred, and engaged with. I asked Joseph Borrell, what will you engage in with us? You know what he said? Go away from Mali. And that's the thrust of the policy. And I am speaking frankly about this. I don't think that there is any violation of any ethical standards because they themselves have been talking about this publicly. I'm just providing examples which illustrate their mindset. And in terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, yes, this is a question that has already been discussed actively in Vienna behind the scenes because the IAEA is responsible for the non-proliferation regime and responsible for ensuring that nuclear activity not be used for military purposes. On the submarine, if I recall correctly, the uranium needs to be enriched to 90%. That is nuclear uranium, or weapons-grade uranium. So here, I think there will be a need for us to take to request of the IAEA for its expertise. And attempts of a non-nuclear state to create such submarines did happen. I don't recall when, who exactly, but this happened some decades ago. And this was this collapsed ultimately and was no longer relevant. But now the deal did take place, and if the IAEA confirms that everything is in order there, in terms of security and things not being used for military purposes, there is there's a whole queue there for such submarines now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foreign Minister. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press, and it's always so nice to see you back here. Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a warning ahead of this week's high-level meeting that the world could be plunged into a new and probably more dangerous Cold War unless the United States and China repair what he called their totally dysfunctional relationship. He said a new Cold War must be avoided at all costs, and warned that it would be different from the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States, and I quote, and probably more dangerous and more difficult to manage. What is Russia's reaction to this warning from the Secretary General?
Don't think that we haven't considered this problem until before Antonio Guterres flagged it. Of course, we see the tensions heightening in relations between China and the United States. We see who's playing the first fiddle in this unfortunate development of events. And of course, this is something which is of great concern to us. Any confrontational schemes do not help ordinary civilians to live on our shared planet. Be this the Indo-Pacific strategy, which was proclaimed recently, which clearly set out the objectives, a key one of which is deterring China's development to South China Sea, be it the code established under these strategies or the trilateral union that was recently proclaimed of Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, the purpose of which is also to help Australia deter the Chinese threat. I met today and yesterday with a number of ministers representing member states of the Association of ASEAN, Southeast Asian states, and I specifically asked them about where things stand, whether there's a relationship between China and ASEAN. Yes, there are negotiations moving towards a legally binding code of conduct on the South China Sea, and this is probably the most reliable way to ensure freedom of navigation and everything that is required by our Western partners, for the sake of which they constantly create provocation here and non-provocative military maneuvers, and thereby creating geopolitical anti-Chinese schemes. We are in favor of ensuring that relations between great powers be mutually respectful. We are keen to ensure that never will, for these relations never to morph into nuclear war, of course, and it's very good that Presidents Putin and Biden reaffirmed the non-acceptability of a nuclear war in principle when they met in Geneva. But I also think that any war between great powers, between nuclear powers, is not acceptable because the risks of it morphing into a nuclear conflict are tremendous. So for this reason, one of the proposals, humankind hasn't thought up anything new here. There's a need to negotiate. There's a need to seek to find compromise. There's a need to deal, like President Trump was fond of saying. That's the right word, not just in business, but also in politics. And in politics, this is necessary to create conditions for normal life and not for anybody's ambitions to be pushed through for the sake of everybody thinking that they're the best and the coolest on earth. This is probably clear for ordinary people. And for great powers to perceive their great responsibility both before their own populations and before all of humankind, President Putin proposed, as you are aware, to convene a summit of permanent members of the Security Council on the reasons behind the pandemic. This work has been drawn out, but we are revitalizing it now, and we are keen to reach agreement with our partners, with the 3 Western permanent members of the Security Council, with China, on specific questions that will have to be put on the agenda. And in that format, we may perhaps begin with an online meeting. But this is the only way, I'm talking about negotiations, the only way to find solutions to all of the problems. And it's of fundamental importance that as permanent members of the Security Council, that we show an example to others.
HLW.
Thank you, Maria. With regard to the withdrawal of foreign forces, official and non-official mercenaries, foreign fighters from Libya, there are 2 schools of thoughts. Some argues that they should only withdraw after the election of a government and they'll be asked officially by the newly elected government. And there are those who say, no, they must withdraw before the election, before the 24th of December, to ensure the integrity and the credibility of the elections. The spokesperson of the president of the Presidential Council this morning stated that in your meeting with Mr. Al-Manfi, you stressed on 2 points. One of them, the need for the reconciliations between Libyan parties, and the second one, the withdrawal of foreign forces. How does Russia perceive the foreign forces withdrawal from Libya before or after the election of a government elected by the people, or before, to ensure the integrity and the credibility and the transparency of this election? Thank you, sir.
Это не имеет принципиального.
Well, Well, that isn't of crucial importance whether that happens before or after the elections. The most important thing is that at the second Berlin conference in June of this year, the outcome document of that conference stipulated that all foreign armed forces must leave Libya. Our Turkish colleagues said that they were invited there by the lawful leadership, namely Mr. Siraj, the president of the Presidency Council, but the other part of Libyan society, namely the Tobruk parliament, which is no less legitimate than the government. Both those bodies were established under the Herat agreements, and the legitimate parliament, together with the legitimate Libyan National Army, invited armed forces from abroad to their part of the country. So this situation, and also in parallel to this, those who could be called mercenaries also appeared, and such people are being redeployed to Libya from Syria, and they're also present on both sides. They're coming from Chad, from other African countries. So from the outset, when this topic was mentioned, we said that we are in favor of doing this, but given that both sides of the Libyan conflict have foreign forcers present on their behalf, it's necessary for them to leave incrementally, but also in a synchronized manner, so that there isn't a military imbalance on one side or the other. The ceasefire has held for more than a year now, and there should be no attempts to create temptations to return to military methods and to force to try to resolve the problems of their country.
Plan of withdrawal incrementally and at the same time between the two parties. Are you helping them?
Они должны этим заниматься.
They need to be doing this in their own 5+5 committee. We're ready to assist, but if they continue dealing with other issues that aren't a priority, well, there are two schools of thought, but there's also a third school of thought, which is that there won't be any elections in 2024. They've just adopted legislative arrangements for the elections, and then the parliament voted on the legitimacy of the government and so on and so forth, the government of Deba. So they need to be prompted towards a serious conversation about arrangements for the futures. There are already speculations about whether or not the current leaders could run in the elections. And there seem to be agreements that they wouldn't participate in these elections, but they seem to want to. Our colleagues in the Secretariat are also trying to create artificial complications when it comes to the format of the UN presence in Libya. The best thing to do now is to focus on the implementation of the agreements made a year ago. Nobody expected them to even come to an agreement in October of last year, but they did. So there shouldn't be any attempts to now refashion this in somebody's favor and to push through hidden agendas.
Yeah.
Hi, Frank Uciardo from TRT World. It's good to see you back here again. Thank you for having this press conference. I wanted to ask you where you are in negotiations in terms of the START pact with the U.S. and also in terms of the use of nuclear weapons, your reaction to the recent missile launches by both North and South Korea. What do you see as an incentive for Kim Jong-un to even come back to the negotiating table?
Ну, во-первых,
Well, on the second question, I heard that Pyongyang has been sending signals regarding their interest in normalizing relations with South Korea. And we've always supported direct dialogue between the North and the South. This isn't something that the previous American administration was always in favor of because it wanted to control the whole process. But I think that in this new context, the Biden administration will be prepared to act more constructively in order to promote the resumption of normal contacts between North and South Korea. And of course, missile launches are not helpful in this, but we've noticed that this time, when this took place, South Korea sought to avoid overly dramatizing the situation, and I think that that's the right thing to do. As soon as we resort to public denouncements and rhetoric, this significantly reduces incentives for a calm, peaceful diplomatic dialogue, because any final agreement can only be reached through quiet, confidence-based contacts and negotiations rather than simply launching accusations into a microphone against each other. When it comes to our negotiations with the U.S. on strategic stability, the first round of talks was held in July, and the second one is to take place next week.
Sergey
Viktorovich, thank you. My question is as follows. As the General Assembly is meeting now in New York, in the South District Court of New York, one of our citizens was refused release, along with Victor Bout, and the press has repeatedly shared information that there are certain talks about exchanging them for American counterparts. So whose court is the ball in right now, and how realistic is this exchange scenario? Well, I can't really speak for the U.S. or forecast whatever they might do, but we have repeatedly tried to address the fate of our citizens through the Council of Europe Convention on the transfer of prisoners to serve punishment in their native countries, and the U.S. is a party to this Council of Europe Convention, as are we, but they categorically refuse to listen to anything, including to arguments about the fact that those citizens, as many others, that this was just all a provocation. It was a cunning ploy that entrapped them. They were literally abducted in violation. Butov's case was a violation of Thailand's legislation. Yaroshenko, it was a violation of Liberia's legislation. There were other cases when they, for example, Seleznyov in the Maldives, they simply kidnapped him in the Maldives, put him in a plane and took him away without anyone knowing anything. So these methods of a provoked attack on our people in an attempt to achieve, I'm not sure what, either to get them to cooperate or achieve some other goals, well, all this is unacceptable. And when it comes to an exchange, we have long said, the Presidents Biden and Putin in Geneva also spoke about this in Geneva. We have agreed that through our security forces, which are managing this issue, both in our case and in Washington, that they will be holding talks in terms of coming to agreements and options that would be mutually acceptable. But so far, we have not arrived at any such options. The U.S. seems to be interested only in getting their own citizens back and are not seriously considering our wishes. What they're most interested in is, or who rather, is Willen, who was convicted of espionage and was caught red-handed. This is a crime that in no way compares with the reasons for the detention of Yaroshenko and Bout for more than 20 years. But we are willing to negotiate, and we have other U.S. citizens that for some reason do not interest the administration in Washington. But of course, it's always better to talk than not.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. Yeah. It's me, right?
No, Evelyn, please.
Gender balance.
Sorry.
Evelyn, we hear you. You forgot your question. You're looking into your computer. Yeah.
Mr. Minister, it's very good to see you here again.
It's a coffee break.
Sorry, as I said, it's good to see you again. On the JCPOA, the United States seems to want to do some, wants to discuss the militia that that Iran has floating around the Middle East? Is this holding up the JCPOA? And on Syria, why doesn't Damascus allow the UN to have humanitarian trips there? I know there's a compromise made in the Security Council, but it doesn't seem to make sense. Does Syria, Damascus think that UN humanitarian workers are a Trojan horse? Or anyway, your opinion is considered.
Насчет СВПД.
On the JCPOA, we are talking only about a full relaunch of the effectiveness of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action without any additions or preconditions, whereas attempts to saddle it with additional preconditions, namely such as the requirement to include the Iranian missile program in the negotiations, or to discuss, as our Western colleagues say, the behavior of Iran in the region, well, that's not going to go anywhere. We shouldn't mix apples and oranges. These things need to be dealt with separately. First of all, agreements on the nuclear program, and then if there are concerns about behavior, well, Iran also has certain concerns regarding others' behaviors, and this is normal in any region. The countries of the Gulf have fairly elaborate foreign political activity that goes beyond the region, and that needs to be taken into account. In connection with this, we recalled that many years ago, Russia developed a concept of collective security in the Gulf, which provided for dialogue that was more or less similar to the meetings on security and cooperation in Europe to discuss peace and confidence building, discuss transparency and military activity, to carry out joint exercises and carry out other positively oriented projects. We've already had policy discussions on the topic with scientists from all countries of the region as well as other countries. And in August of this year, based on those discussions, we updated our approach to ensuring collective security in the Gulf region. This document was issued as an official document of the General Assembly and Security Council. We believe that it is precisely through such a forum, which I hope we will be able to convene, it's just through such a forum that concerns on the missiles, in the appearance of missiles in the region, should be discussed. And it's not only Iran who has missiles, as well as concerns over various countries' policies. The conflict in Yemen is an evident example of where the interests of Iran and Arab states are evident, and there's a need to come to an agreement. And such a forum, in our view, would, of course, first of all, be broader than simply the Gulf region. It's hard to separate Iraq and Egypt out, or Jordan. They are all part of the process when it comes to creating a common platform for constructive dialogue. Of course, the League of Arab States should also participate, and the P5 of the Security Council. The European Union, I believe, will also be interested. I think that this is a very specific, a concrete, and realistic approach. At the very least, I have sensed my colleagues' interest in this. Yesterday, we met with the ministers of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they are interested in this. And we agreed that as part of the ministerial contacts resuming between us, we will give this issue priority. Regarding humanitarian assistance in Syria, I talked about this yesterday in detail with the Secretary General, and we simply cannot accept a situation when grave, glaring double standards are applied. The issue of refugees, which I think there are some 6 million of in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, in November of last year, Damascus, with our support and the support of some other 20 states, held a conference on refugees in order to discuss conditions for their return home, where I'm sure the vast majority of them want to return. And we were frankly flabbergasted, first of all, the U.S. did everything to threaten and intimidate those expected at that conference in Damascus. And we likewise were very surprised that the United Nations did not participate in this conference, and only its representative in Damascus attended as an observer. At the time, I wrote to Antonio Guterres to say that this is non-compliance with Resolution 2254, which should be the basis of UN's activity in Syria, and which clearly states that every effort needs to be made to ensure humanitarian shipment delivery and create conditions for the return of refugees. I would also like to note that at the beginning of this year, the EU held its annual, I believe, conference in Brussels on Syrian refugees, which did not provide for the participation of the Syrian Arab Republic. But the co-chair of this conference was the Secretary General of the UN together with the EU. And this is something that we find surprising, especially given that it wasn't just Syria who was not participating in a grave violation of international humanitarian law, but also that the funds being raised at that conference weren't meant for rebuilding infrastructure in Syria for their return, but rather to pay for their stay in these third countries rather than helping them return. So these violations of international humanitarian law are something that I would ask our friends in mass media to look at, the mass media who claim concern over the lives of ordinary civilians in areas of conflict. And that compromise resolution, as you rightly said, which we adopted in July, does indeed give a 6-month extension to the so-called cross-border mechanism for the delivery of humanitarian assistance, primarily from Turkey to the Idlib de-escalation zone. But in a situation where the West is holding tight onto this mechanism, which hasn't been negotiated with Damascus and which also runs counter to international humanitarian law, well, we have serious reason to believe that there is likely a hidden agenda here. Information regarding the content of those trucks going into the Idlib de-escalation zone is not provided to us in any detail. The UN claims that it inspects every shipment, but it's impossible to verify this. And whatever those shipments may contain, nobody knows exactly how it is then distributed within the Idlib de-escalation zone. And no one knows whether or not terrorists from the HTS and other unacceptable entities are taking advantage of these shipments and using them for their own means. So if no concrete steps are taken now to unblock the processes for the delivery of humanitarian aid through Damascus, which is required under international humanitarian law, well, we will be shutting down these non-transparent transporter activities, especially since the adoption of the resolution that demanded that assistance also be sent through Damascus. One convoy was sent, but not fully. Only half the shipments that were expected for nearly a year were not able to make it into the relevant regions. But the International Committee of the Red Cross, together with the Syrian Red Crescent Society, the convoy that they prepared, the shipment that they sent in April 2020, still hasn't gone anywhere. So those who care about the fate of those suffering from hunger need to urge, first of all, Western states who could affect the situation, but also urge the leadership of the United Nations, which is simply obligated to implement that resolution. And let us not forget that in addition to purely humanitarian aspects of assistance to Syria and humanitarian routes, that resolution also contains requirements to begin early recovery projects, water supply, electricity, housing, schools, healthcare. All this needs to be done, and the Secretariat knows this full well. It's not easy for them right now in a situation where, well, let's be frank, throughout the entire Syrian crisis, the Secretariat has been very passive in dealing with issues to create conditions to facilitate the return of refugees. But that security resolution was adopted unanimously, and it needs to be implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Minister. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I'm the one who keep asking you about the question of Palestine. This time is not an exception. Yesterday, President Abbas said that if Israel does not end its occupation within a year, the Palestinians would withdraw their recognition of the State of Israel. That would lead to a state of chaos in the Middle East. So my question is, what the Russian Federation, as a friend of Palestinians and also has good relation with Israel, can do to avoid reaching that point? And after the Palestinians losing their faith in the peace process, do they have the right to defend themselves? Do they have the right to resist occupation? Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.
On the Palestinian-Israeli problems, yes, indeed, these are serious problems, and the solutions are not advanced through the mix-ups that we have seen in previous U.S. administration, recognition of the Golan Heights, and then the subsequent attempt to essentially advance annexation through the creation of a quasi-Palestinian state. It's very important that the Biden administration has reaffirmed its commitment to a two-state solution. The Prime Minister of Israel, unfortunately, is not recognizing this or acknowledging that Israeli politicians in parliament have other views, however, with respect to how to provide for security in the Jewish state, not living in a state of constant tensions, and not but rather by reaching agreement on establishing normal, ordinary civilian life through the coexistence of two states in security and prosperity, as stipulated in the principles for settlement, which were endorsed by the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. Nonetheless, we believe that indeed the current Israeli leadership is engaged in talks, there are contacts, and these are largely limited to questions of ensuring their the safety on Palestinian territories and security. We think that it would be an egregious error if, after all, with the processes in the region underway, and what we see in Libya, what we see in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, if amid all of that, if we lose sight of the Palestinian question represents the fruit of the result of the longest modern conflict on the ground, a conflict which was attempted to be resolved through the creation of two states. One state was created very quickly. The second state has not yet been established yet. And I think that it was very wise that nearly 20 years ago, a decision was made by the League of Arab States at the initiative of the King of Saudi Arabia. An Arab peace initiative was adopted, which stipulated that as long as a Palestinian state, as soon as a viable Palestinian state is established, which meets all the criteria set out at the UN, then immediately the Arab states would normalize relations with Israel. I think this was a very wise approach. The Trump administration attempted to append this all, and the Abraham agreements that were advanced with a number of Arab countries proceeded from the following logic. Let's normalize relations between Israel and the Arabs, and then let's think about what to do about the Palestinian problem. Of course, in principle, we welcome any normalization of relations between any states. However, in this specific instance, of course not at the cost of Palestine, and we are heartened by the fact that all those who signed this agreement, including Bahrain and the Emirates, and Sudan and Morocco, they emphasized that they are fully wedded to UN resolutions on finding a solution to the Palestinian problem. And of course, this is something that needs to be defended. The lack of resolution to this problem, we said, if they have a right to a fight, they won't ask anyone. And the fact that the Palestinian problem is unresolved is probably the most considerable factor which fuels radical sentiment on Arab streets. When such extremists say, oh, look, our people are being upset 80 years ago, a state was promised, this was a lie. And young people, especially those who don't have access to education, are very susceptible to this kind of propaganda. And when I explain this aspect of the Middle East situation and the impact of the fact that the Palestinian problem has not been resolved, this impact on stability in the entire region, when Israeli colleagues are, when this is described to Israeli colleagues, they get upset. No, they say it's not the case. This is not a very serious problem. But this is a short-sighted approach on their part. For this reason, we supported the proposal of the President of Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, to convene an international conference. However, we are firmly of the view that there needs to be sufficient preparations to that end. Preparations for this conference is something which, as part of which we wish to revive the Quartet of International Mediators, Russia, US, the EU, and the UN, and to bring into these concerted efforts, to bring in Arab countries. For example, the Quartet of Arab countries with relations with Israel, who have relations with Israel, Egypt and Jordan, the Emirates and Bahrain, for example, and probably Saudi Arabia should also be invited as the author of the Arab Peace Initiative. So 4 + 4 + 1 and +2, Israel and Palestine. If it seems to any of the parties to be premature to immediately meet in this kind of a format, then we stand ready to provide our territory to that end, or to extend any other invitation to Israel or Palestine for direct talks. However, we cannot delay, we cannot drag our feet, and we will strive to advance this approach. There was something else I wanted to say in this connection. Yes, and most importantly, if everything that we discuss now, whereas all of this hinges on many factors, some hinges on Israel, other things hinge on other members of the international structures, there's a question that only is determined by the Palestinians. That is, the Palestinian unity relies on Palestinians' attempts to restore it a few years ago were undertaken. And it had appeared that some agreements were arrived at, election cycles were agreed to. None of this took place. And this dearth of understanding between Ramallah and Gaza has, of course, very adverse consequences. If Palestinians were to reunite, then it would be far easier and more effective for them to discuss with Israel in forthcoming and future negotiations. Prime Minister Netanyahu always said, well, what kind of direct talks are there when I don't know who Mahmoud Abbas represents? Apparently, he only has Ramallah. There are other representatives in Gaza. These are issues which have a very strong impact on attempts to arrive at wide-ranging political results. So we are proactively, well, there's nothing for us to help right now because they are not keen to resolve these questions of restoration of unity, but we're working proactively, nonetheless, with all fractions of Palestinians. We invited them repeatedly to Moscow. All attended. And during the discussions, they say, yes, we need to reunite. But then somehow it all collapsed.
Rose, something. Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Two questions, please. This is Caitlin for CNN. First, the European Commission this week accused Russia of being connected to cyber attacks against European politicians and press, namely German officials and politicians, which is a concern ahead of their elections tomorrow. Could you please respond to that accusation? And also, if you have any hopes for the outcome of the German election, I'd love to hear it. And then my second question...
What was the other one?
The European Commission is accused...
Yeah. The end of this phrase.
If you have any hopes for the outcome of the German election on Sunday. And then my second question is just the family of Trevor Reed feels he's been wrongly held and is facing an unusually long sentence. If you could respond to that as well, please.
Who?
Trevor Reed.
Ну, насчет Тревора.
On Trevor Reed, I already mentioned, I talked about Mr. Whelan and Mr. Reed. One was arrested, Whelan, for espionage, and the second was arrested for attacking, and for attacking and hitting a police officer more than once. Do you know how long U.S. citizens get? How many there's prison sentences for attacking a police officer? They are lengthy, and as was mentioned, Yeroshiv and Boot were deceived to say that they would be ready to provide an aircraft for certain purposes, but then they were accused of weapons smuggling and narcotics. They received sentences of more than 20 years without attacking anybody a single time, without having a single plan to violate international rules on trade and any given goods. So there's a need for consistency. I would advise our U.S. colleagues be consistent. They get upset if somebody is arrested here. Well, they need to apply uniform standards in the event of attacks against police officers. Take a look now at what will transpire in the trial on the so-called storming of the Capitol. So the first question, right. Well, we are ready to consider any facts, but we are not being provided with the facts. There are only baseless accusations of our responsibility back in 2007 for having poisoned Litvinenko with polonium in London, and not a single shred of evidence was provided. The case was closed. It was made official, which enables the judges to, behind closed doors, examine and pore over secretive material. And now there are attempts to do the exact same with the trial about the woman who died in Salisbury. In the context of the so-called Skripal case, the trial for her death is something that they also wish to do behind closed doors for secret documents to be provided. But nobody's showing us these documents. We are being blamed for everything. For the Skripals, we see the same. We see the same with the Malaysian Boeing. Incidentally, we are constantly being accused. But the court in The Hague ruled that they have justification to believe the United States, who have announced that they have satellite images proving that Russia did it. But they haven't shown this satellite imagery to anybody. And the Dutch court believes this is okay, this is normal. If the US said it, then we take them at their word. Like Schwarzenegger said. Trust me, more or less. But Mr. Reagan adds, but trust but verify, Mr. Reagan said. We want there to be verification. We provided on the Malaysian Boeing, we provided all of the radar data, and we provided a lot more. The Ukrainians are refusing to provide radar data. Allegedly, they were all shut down during the period when this disaster transpired. They're not providing communications, dispatcher communications. This is probably something obvious which should be provided, and there's a lot. We are being accused, as you know, of interference in elections in the United States. I repeatedly, with my colleagues, specifically with Rex Tillerson, I discussed this matter when he announced that they had irrefutable data and information about Russian interference in 2016 elections. And I said, if you have incontrovertible evidence, then show them to us. And they said, no, we won't show you. Turn to your intelligence officers and they will understand. So that's the thrust of the discussion. Is that normal? The same with cyber attacks. The U.S. authorities and President Biden put this question forward in Geneva during a meeting with Putin, accusing of our hackers of attacking some kind of meat factory, oil pipeline, demanding the payment of ransom. And indeed, Mr. Biden did mention that according to our information, it's not your government that is doing this, but people on the territory of the Russian Federation are doing this. We drew attention to the fact that in the past year, we have the largest number of hackings targeting our resources from the United States, approximately half of them, some from Germany and some from other countries, in part of the remaining 50%. And 45 times, we submitted official requests with concrete evidence requiring consideration to U.S. colleagues. There were only 9 responses. We received an official approximately 10 requests for answers, and we provided answers for each of them. I'm very pleased that Presidents Putin and Biden discussed this matter in Geneva, and the Americans agreed to depart from such sporadic accusations and grievances to systemic work. Special channels were established between the services dealing with cybersecurity, and so as a result, we do have hope that there will be progress.
Выборы в Германии.
Выборы в Германии.
Oh, for the elections in Germany, I wish them all luck.
Последних вопроса, пожалуйста. Last 2 questions, please.
Last week, the preliminary results of the investigation of Special Prosecutor Durham, who was looking into so-called Russiagate, and it reveals one of the initiators, one of the people behind the whole affair. And this is not the first time that we're seeing a paradoxical situation where U.S. officials themselves overturn the very accusations that came from them, from the U.S. towards Russia. So the question is, this paradox, well, the fact that this was overturned and ruled out, whereas the connected sanctions remain. So what is the position of Moscow, and what do U.S. partners say? Well, I think you answered your own question. Of course, such back and forth is unacceptable. It's unacceptable to make such claims without thinking them through, without getting down to the heart of the matter. And once you do get to the heart of the matter, it's unacceptable to do nothing to play the situation back, to attempt to right what was done wrong. Unfortunately, we're used to these American tactics. We're never going to ask for sanctions to be lifted. We are done asking. We've exceeded our limit. We'll look at Ukraine, our neighbor, who keeps asking and fails to understand what's going on. We're not going to engage in that. And we don't have other partners, but gradually, as I said, I don't want to be pessimistic, but gradually on certain areas such as strategic stability and cybersecurity, we are building a dialogue that gives hope that one day, at least in certain areas of intergovernmental relations, that we will establish a systematic, mutually respectful process.
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim from the Daily Arabic Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper. I have first a follow-up on the issue of Palestine. Many will say that settlements are actually eating a lot of land, that you have 500,000 settlers, and the two-state solution is not anymore viable, given the fact that, given these facts. So what's your comments? And maybe they would say that maybe the international community should start thinking about a one-state solution equal for everyone. And my question is about Yemen and the humanitarian situation there. As you know, Mr. Beasley said 2 days ago that there is at least about 50,000 Yemenis who are living in famine condition. There's millions of Yemenis who need aid and food. They are suffering from hunger. So my question to you, do you believe that the international community, which Russia is part of, failed the Yemeni people by not putting enough pressure on parties to the conflict, whether the Houthis or the Saudi-led coalition? Thank you.
Я не могу сказать.
Well, I can't say that the international community isn't doing enough to convince the parties to that conflict to engage in negotiations and to stop launching accusations against each other and to come to an agreement. There's a large number of factors which regrettably, while being completely subjective and related to the wishes of certain individuals to stay in power longer, they are negatively impacting the negotiating process and negatively impacting the prospects for reaching an agreement. I won't go into details, but the fact that Yemen is a country that is home to the largest humanitarian disaster in the world, that this is something that was said a long time ago when the conflict just began and it was in its acute phase. Through our embassy, we have an ambassador working in El Riyadh right now. A group of ambassadors has been established supporting this process and supporting the Secretary General's envoy. And I hope that gradually this completely dead-end approach to delaying an agreement, that everyone will realize that this will not achieve anything. With regard to settlement activity, we have always denounced this activity, and we warned against the very same thing that you mentioned, that this will create facts on the ground that would simply not allow for the formation of a Palestinian state. And I've also heard talks about a single state solution, but as you said, a decision in which everyone would be equal, I think, is unrealistic. Many researchers say that if that happens, the Jewish nature of the Israeli state will be undermined. And if we do not give equal rights to the entire population of Israel, well, researchers believe that this carries a risk of establishing an apartheid state. So I'm convinced that the two-state solution is the only way. And let me underscore once again, many in Israel's political elite agree and believe that this is something that needs to be actively advanced.
Thank you so much for participation in the press conference. This is it.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye.